So, Berto, deep dive on immigration. You wanted to do an episode on the subject of immigration. And as we've been doing this more and more lately, you are taking the reins and doing all the prep. And I am, I guess, the horse in this scenario. And you are going to lead the way. So, start us off, Berto.
Let's do it, man. Far... We've been traveling far. I don't remember how the melody goes in this part. Without a home. Do you remember the melody?
Is this from a
But
musical?
now without a star. The chorus goes something like, they're coming to America.
Yeah.
Isn't it like, we've been traveling without a home?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, so I wanted to open with this song because when I was little, and I would travel between Colombia and the United States because there was a time period where my dad was living in New York and I was living in Colombia, so I'd come to visit him. And then also when my mom was living up here and I would come to visit her. When we were coming to America, like they would, I think ritualistically, play that song
Oh, really?
in the airplane. Yeah, like over the little headphones and stuff. And I always found it, even as a little kid, I found it slightly disturbing. I liked the song, but I also felt like, am I being brainwashed? It was kind of this thing. You're coming to America.
Yeah, it's funny what Neil Diamond songs have survived into 2025 and which have not.
Right.
But that was a giant hit.
That was a giant hit.
I don't ever hear that on throwback radio stations.
But it's interesting because the sentiment was actually, it was a very self-aggrandizing statement, but at the same time, it was, we huddle close, hang on to a dream, on the boats and on the plains, never looking back. Home, don't it seem so far away, in the eye of the storm, home to a new and shiny place, make our bed. Basically the whole, like, give us your tired, your poor, the Statue of Liberty, Superman, the American dream, like that thing. So yes, somewhat like self-important, but also kind of full of hope. And quite honestly, for someone coming from a third world country, it would have been something where like, yeah, I'm coming to America, man.
Yeah, we're old enough to remember when our society believed in the American dream. But we now live in an era where we don't acknowledge that for many people, including my ancestors, yours as well, or you yourself, I guess, came to the United States and actually did benefit.
That's right.
And did get a version of the American dream.
That's right.
It's not a perfect city on a hill, but it's better than where we came from.
It was opportunity.
Yeah.
That if you worked,
I've done a lot of genealogy, and my people came from famine and political difficulties in Japan, in Sweden, in England, in Ireland. The United States wasn't perfect, but it was better than where they were coming from.
Right.
So not only just in terms of being able to live and not die in your home country, but also the promise that is somewhat delivered in terms of freedom and acceptance and the rule of law, the Constitution, protections, understanding that immigrants are important and that foundation of this country is on immigration. But as soon as you say that, especially in my circles, you have to acknowledge Native Americans and that they weren't asking us to come.
Yeah.
And they didn't benefit from us coming. And you also have to acknowledge that it's not all fun and games for everybody, and that the American dream isn't what it's promised to be, and that even that line in that Neil Diamond song of never looking back.
Never looking back.
Well, looked at in a certain way, that's a command of assimilation.
Right. You better not speak the other language. You better not. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So, but I wanted to open with that because I have a very personal, as you obviously know and can imagine, connection, and as you do too from your family lines, and then also me literally coming to this country, that is personal. So like everything that's been going on and the immigration, all these things, not only because I went through it, but also a lot of Latin culture and anti-Latin sentiments mixed in. So
but answer me this: why did you want to do this deep dive?
Because of that, right? Because a lot of times when we do things,
but you personally, you know what I mean, like.
Yeah, okay, because I've been afraid, because I feel like myself and those that are from my cultural origin or whatever are at threat, are impacted.
By Trump.
By Trump and the current administration's policies and actions.
You were talking with me a few months ago, and you were legit worried that maybe your mom was going to get held up at the border.
Right. Exactly.
Like you have relatives that didn't want to go back to Colombia to visit family for fear of being not let back in.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to start with looking back a little bit. You just mentioned like, hey, we got here, but most of the people, actually literally all the people that live here that are not Native Americans came here after Native Americans were here, right? Like by definition. So looking back to prehistory a little bit, I knew some of this stuff, but not a lot of it. Because actually growing up in Colombia, I didn't really study too much of what happened in North America. You can imagine, you just don't focus as much.
Aside from watching Airwolf a lot.
Oh yeah, dude. Da, 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 da. Okay, so what would you say, quick quiz, if you were going to put a year like in the, let's say 5,000 year increments, what do you think is the oldest evidence we might have of people coming to North America?
Well, there's been a lot of debate in the anthropological, archaeological society, and there's ever more increasing evidence pushing back the date further and further. But there were the Clovis people. There's not a lot of data, because not a lot survives to today, but their stone tools will survive, and so they can estimate the date of those things, and will estimate that there was a migration because there was a mini ice age in the past, right? So there was an ice bridge between Siberia and Alaska, and so there were presumably packs of people that were following the migratory movements of game, like woolly mammoth and the mastodons and that kind of stuff, or I don't know, other kinds of game that
and T-Rex.
Yeah. And they weren't literally just walking across the bridge. It was like over generations, just inching further and further to areas where it wasn't being populated by people because there would be more game there. The main wave of what believed to be the Native Americans that white people encountered 500 years ago were a wave that came over kind of recently, I think, like maybe 3,000, 5,000 years ago or something.
See, I was glad. I knew you were going to know way more about this than I knew by default, so it's good. Yeah, so obviously all this is, people investigate this constantly. It's their life's career, and it always, new evidence comes up. So on the first hand, obviously there's a difference between what you can find in terms of like artifacts and things like that versus concrete evidence of how early people even came here, because some of that might not be preserved. But as of sort of recently, 2020, there was some evidence that as early, I guess, as 30,000 years ago, there was some evidence that people traveled by boat to North America. By boat. So yes, the land bridge, all that's true. But apparently, there is evidence that people traveled by boat even that long ago, which is insane.
Yeah, the Polynesian
crazy
boat culture. Yeah, I mean,
I can't imagine being like, I see an island over there. I'm like, I don't think I'm gonna get in a boat.
No, they don't see it.
No, I know, but I'm saying even if I saw the island,
they don't even see the boat. That's the crazy thing about this.
Go out in the water.
Well, the thing that you have to reckon with is probably most expeditions of these boat people ended up in death because they didn't. Because if you've looked at a map of the Pacific, this is where they would go. It's the Pacific,
right?
So you would imagine that you just head off in a random vector and you're gonna die.
Yeah.
But what seems to point to is that, as with any culture, you just iterate and learn, right?
Yeah.
And since resources were dependent on your boat and navigation and star mapping, learning how to build a boat, learning how to set sail, learning how to follow the currents and stuff, that ability meant that 10 boat tribes would fling themselves away from an island.
Right.
One happened to find an island as a combination of luck and ability, and
Sure.
they pass on those knowledges to the next culture.
Yeah.
Their population grows on an island because there's abundant food, right?
Mm-hmm.
And too many people, so you start to get some, wayward travelers. Is that the right word?
Yeah, wayward son. Look, everything I know about sailing in the Pacific, I learned from watching Moana. So I'm a bit of an expert.
Well, it's funny because Moana isn't a bad intro,
Right.
Right.
But of course, like you were saying, in addition to these fossils of things that seem to indicate people traveling by boat, there was the Beringia land bridge, which is basically Siberia and Alaska were connected via a land bridge. Everything was frozen.
Are we sure it's pronounced Beringia?
It looks like Beringia. It could be Beringi. And that stuff can just there's this huge range. The amount of time the land bridge was there was anywhere from 60,000 to 25,000 years ago. Who knows? But definitely there's evidence that as early as 20,000 years ago and all the way to around, and the land bridge actually disappeared about 12,000 years ago. So for about 8 to 10,000 years, there could have been people migrating over there. So Fred Flintstone is confirmed, basically. Okay, so then so all these waves start coming. You mentioned the Clovis, absolutely. I didn't know about the Clovis, but around 9,000 years ago, they had fluted spear points. What are fluted spear points? Fluted.
I think fluted meaning
with a hole?
That it has some way of attaching to a wood pole or something. I'm not sure.
And they were hunters, of course. And then there's the Na-Dene peoples. Na-Dene. Is it Na-Dene or Na-Dene? No, It's got a little accent, so I know that's Na-Dene. That's around 8,000 BC. And so all these folks are the precursors to tribes like Navajo and Apache and so forth. And then after that, of course, people start settling, cultures start developing, and then ice starts melting. So the folks start getting landlocked, let's say, in the North American region. It's hard to know how many people migrated south versus how many people also arrived south from the sea as well.
Yeah.
But clearly there are people all throughout America, not just North America, which is really incredible. If you think about the amount of migration over time, because these are distances that in those times, even without carts, right? You don't have carts or anything, so you're walking pretty much.
Well, and we don't know exactly, but as I was saying, it's less migration and more like there's more food over that hill.
Right. And it's not just like you walk all the way down to South America. Right. It's like your generations. But okay, so eventually these things develop into a lot of the natives that were encountered by the folks, the Europeans that started coming on over a lot later. So I'm doing this because, and I think we all know this, but this is a land that has been populated by people for time immemorial. So right off the bat, anyone that's like, I'm from here, it's like, well, yeah, you're from here recently. Your relatives have been here for 200 years, and then there's other people whose relatives have been for 10,000 years.
Right. I mean, this is something that conservatives will use sometimes. They'll say, well, everyone's an immigrant, including Native Americans. And yeah, I guess in a certain sense, but it's not really immigration, as I was saying. It was a slow process in all likelihood. And it was an expansion of borders, essentially, over generations. So we don't want to get into that trap of saying that we can deny Native Americans their agency and their advocacy just because they, too, have ancestors that might have come. And we should acknowledge that some Native Americans hold that that's not true, that they sprung from the earth.
Well, right. And either way, no matter what, if you wanted to be like, well, we have, such and such person has a right to this land because they have documents that show they've been here for 150 years, there could easily be someone else that's like, well, I had someone there 300
Right. It all comes, the only reason why people fight about this is because money is on the line.
Exactly.
Land, money, power, political power, it all comes back to money. And when you start to divvy up or gather control over such things, you're going to start seeing some odd arguments being made, right?
Yeah, I think as humans around the world, not just here, we sort of have to pick a time, maybe it's a range of time, where we're like, yeah, we're just going to call it good from here on out because history is horrible and everyone got murdered. And so, yeah, let's just start now, and that's kind of something that has to happen. But then the hard part is, so the way that the Americas were colonized varied pretty significantly, because the way that the Spanish colonization happened was essentially these military/paramilitary excursions to go and get goods and stuff and take them back to the Spanish Empire. And it was all centrally controlled. And that had some positive and many negative effects. On the positive side, which is odd, I hadn't considered this, but I was listening to a podcast about this. It did establish this weird feeling of social order and social rights. Obviously, it's a horrible thing to think about, because when we talk about social rights,
for the record, DNA evidence suggests that most of your ancestors were these conquerors, these extractors,
the Spanish, exactly. But what's weird to think about is they established this super hierarchical society where at the very top were the Spaniard kings, right? King and queen from Spain. Then the top of the church, which actually they were the top of the church, but right under there were like the archbishops in Spain. And then you get to like Spanish-born people in Spain. And then you get to Spanish-born people in the New World. And then and there's this super hierarchy.
I hate the fucking term New World. I hate it.
Yeah, well, that's what they called it, right? And
I don't give a shit.
Well, that is what they called it.
I know.
Because the world...
But I just want to say for the record, I hate that fucking... And people will be like, well, okay, but it was also new to the migratory patterns of the Clovis people as well. It was new to them. And I'm like, shut the fuck up. It's new to white people in Europe. It's not new to the people that were here.
You know what I mean? even China was new to them. Another fine point, for the Spanish crown, the world revolved around Spain and them.
Yeah.
Not just the New World.
Yeah, and you talked about this before.
The world.
How in
like
Colombia
England
and Brazil,
not,
eventually it becomes this super hierarchical structure of, of different shades of white, and then it branches off into Native American skin tone and black skin tone. So you would say like the worst of the worst would be half black, half Native American.
Right, exactly.
And then up from there would be...
Because they really devalued mixing races, right?
Okay. And then up from there would be a full black person. Up from there would be a Native American.
Actually, Native American was lower because the full black person you had paid money for, and although there were also, of course, Native American slaves, oftentimes they had less value. It's a horrible thing to think about. But then there's this flip side, which is that there was this sentiment of like the idea of society, not just individual. And even though on its inception, it's a horrible thing, because the society that we're talking about is this structured hierarchical thing with horrible abuses, it did prep the way for a different way to thinking about the relationship of individuals in society. And the other thing is that there were prominent Catholic priests from Spain that had come to the New World, and they were actually trying to establish social norms. They were saying things like, no, you guys call the natives animals, but actually it's the invading force, it's us that are acting like animals because blah, 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 stuff like this. And I'm bringing this up because I always only thought of it, having been from there, as a net negative, the way it was all structured, right? Because it's horrible. It's like
net negative that conquistadors came.
That came, and then they structured society that way.
You saw that as negative.
Always only negative. And for the most part, it is.
And then you started listening to a podcast by Ben Shapiro, and then you decided you decided differently.
No, well, and I always thought of the U.S. as positive, or the way that the U.S. was colonized. I always thought of it as positive because I thought, well, like my narrative was usually, the way that the North America and the U.S. was colonized was families came here, and families established, these nice little living areas, and They were just trying to make their family work and live and stuff. Whereas in Latin America, it was all these soldiers killing and raping everyone.
Right. And
that was my narrative.
And, there's some truth to that in
Right.
that the English came to stay for the most part, whereas the Spanish came to kill and extract and enslave and ruin. You know what I mean? Not that English people didn't also do stuff like that.
Right.
But it was a different mission.
Right. And so what I've learned, actually a lot of it through doing this, is, for example, when the first folk from the Virginia Company and whatnot, they landed on the East Coast, a lot of the natives died because of disease, just like they did in South America. Well, in South America, there were tons of debates about this.
They also died because of murder and rape.
Right. But like things were documented and all that. It doesn't mean, I mean, they still died. And there was, right, in both cases, they still died. Up here, the narrative became that the land was empty. So it was ready for colonization. And it's a dark version of distorting reality. So I didn't know these things, right? I was like, oh, well, that's horrible. Just as like the other part is horrible. The other aspect that was interesting is that it did set up the colonization of this land in North America and the United States. It set it up in this manifest destiny way, which is, hey, we have the godly right to this land, and we will expand as far as we can, and all these kinds of things. And it's all about the individual rights. Right, society rights are not as important as in the individual rights, and there's always good and bad things to all of these.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that, like the most important aspect of the society as it was developing here were the rights of the individual. I as an individual have the right to go and conquer a new land, go establish my home, all these kinds of things.
Right, it's the right of particular individuals.
Yeah, and then the government and the society is sort of like secondary to that. And there's a lot of good things to that, because that establishes the ability to have freedoms.
Are you referring to the English structure of law? Is that what you're saying?
More like the structure of law as started developing here
after the revolution.
When even before the revolution, when folks started like expanding.
So you're talking about the expectation of the rights of the white people in the East Coast.
That's right. Yeah.
You're talking about the way that they philosophically understood their rights.
That's right.
Okay.
And then whereas in South America, what started developing was a lot more of social rights, with the individual rights being secondary. So they were closely related, but they were flipped on its axis.
I don't know if you're getting to this. Is this an important point that you're making?
Yeah.
Because I think I'm lost. So you're saying that in Brazil, Colombia, that the rights were understood because of the differences between Spanish colonization culture versus English colonization culture?
No, that the focus was on the social rights, the rights of the society.
Are you talking about white society?
Any society. The society as a... You understand? Like, you could frame something around the individuals.
Yeah.
Or you could frame something around the group of the individuals.
Right.
Right?
As a ham-fisted way, we could talk about collectivist versus individual cultures.
Right. And in the way that the United States started developing, and obviously to this day, the primary thing is the individual, not the society. And that has implications, of course, because, like, I have the right to bear arms. I have the right to this. I have the right to that.
Right. Whereas, like a classic example would be today, like in China, for example, a more collectivist, more societal focused society. Mm-hmm. If your house was in the middle of a zone that was going to be rezoned as a commercial zone for a road or something, then the collective understanding would be that your house would go.
That's
Whereas
right.
the United States, it still might happen, and it has happened, particularly to poor people, when the government just decides to bulldoze your neighborhood.
Right.
But if you have some social clout, then you can fight, and the rest of society will say, hey, that person, even though society would benefit by bulldozing that person's house, there's a line there. And for the mainstream American culture, even going back to the early colonial culture 400 years ago, the 300 years ago, the understanding was that the individual would trump the society.
That's right.
As opposed to society trumping the individual.
And I've always kind of thought, oh, that's good. And I think in general, there's a lot of good things to that.
Which is good? Individual?
The individual.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. So by the way, one of the main reasons that it was flipped on its axis in South America and Central America is because Spain still controlled things well, like even after the revolutions and after they established, the people in charge, that hierarchical structure was still very prominent. Whereas here, basically, except, of course, if you just look at white people, white men in general had the same rights here. And they had those individual rights.
Yeah, well, so I don't know if this helps you, but the way that I have been told this, so actually my mentor, Phil Cushman, who died tragically a few years ago, he wrote a lot about this idea, and he would lecture for hours and hours, and my mind would just be blown, and I can't even approximate what he was downloading into my soul all those hours. But a part of it has to do with sense of self and society and purpose and meaning, and a lot of the things that we see and understand today are not necessarily givens. They're not fundamental truths, right? Part of this we can see in cross-cultural differences like you're talking about right now. Yeah. And it's really hard to wrap one's mind around that you can live in another society that to you would look like a horrible way to live, but because they were raised in that society, and it's not like a lesser society, it's not a society that has brainwashed their people into believing that the individual doesn't matter as much. It's literally just a whole different set of meanings and purposes and understandings and joys and hurts and everything. The self is constructed socially in a lot of ways. And so the way that is particular about mainstream American culture, different to a lot of other cultures, including the Spanish conquistadors and colonizers, the theory is that we come from a particular social meme that was established in the Scandinavian cultures in prehistory, because of the way that the fjords and the islands and the ships and everything, it seemed to develop into a culture that really prized individual rights, or at least the rights of small groups, right? And this idea of manifest destiny of like, that island over there, I want it, and those ideas were selected for, if you will, kind of evolutionary through society, right? And then that migrates through the German, what we call Germany and France, into England and Ireland and stuff. And then that leads to the Magna Carta, right? Yeah. So this is of the people saying that it's an agreement with the king, essentially, right? Of just like, hey, king, you don't have full power. You're going to have to share the power. And that was a completely new idea, right? And so that evolves. Those people, those ideas, those philosophies branch out and eventually migrate to the American colonies and to France, French Revolution and the American Revolution, of just like, no, kings are not, and, we could go back to Rome and the Roman Republic and that sort of, this happened before in Greece and stuff, but in the modern age, if you will, and so mainstream American culture all is rooted in that idea that comes from this Scandinavian idea that was extremely weird, which was that individuals matter. You matter. You are your own king. You're your own sovereign. We, the people. You are a person. You are not just a thing in a feudal society.
And there's so much good that comes with it,
And some bad.
And part of it is this too, that here.
But is that helping what I'm describing? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, because like all of these things, none of this is all good or all bad, right? Like it's all a mix, and no one has solved how to run societies, right? But in this area, in this part of the world, what started happening was Native Americans and Black slaves, they weren't really participants in society at all. Right? Like, so when we talked about like the rules and it was all just like what the white guys cared about.
You know what I mean? No, they weren't in charge of the levers of power, but there were societies of black slaves who were completely disempowered, but you have culture, you have language, you have
no,
traditions.
Of course they have their
So they're
culture.
participating in a society,
In their
but they're not
society.
participating in the society.
Yeah, they're not voting, they're not coming up with laws, they're not represented, any of that. Right. It wasn't the society that was in charge of the land.
Right.
Yeah. In South America, what starts happening though, it's very odd because as a result of the Spaniards coming over, having essentially babies all over the place with the natives, right? And with the slaves and everything, you start getting this mixture of a society that you still have to rule over, right? And so you can't just have your little conclave with your little Spanish-born white Spaniards because that's the tiny minority of people. You actually have to sit there and deal with all of it. Now, there's still horrible discrimination, horrible lack of rights for the lower classes, all these things. But you're still having to develop a slightly different system that sort of takes the society into account more than the individual. And the reason this ends up mattering later is because essentially there's a lot of clash that ends up happening between those two different philosophies, which is one is like, hey, the society is the main thing, and the other one's like, no, the individual is the main thing. And now in modern times, of course, here like the individuals do include the blacks and Latinos and Asians and all these things. But for a long time, it didn't include any of them.
So I'm still kind of lost. So are you saying the difference between the English colonies versus the Spanish colonies?
Not just the colonies, even to this day, the socio-political structures are the way they developed were though.
So you're talking about the difference between North America, Canada, United States versus South America,
and mostly United States. Yeah, it's Canada as well, but it's
so the culture of the United States versus the cultural fruit that grew from the roots of these two different philosophies.
Yeah, and then the political systems that developed.
I see.
Yeah. And so nowadays we have a system here where we see this all the time, where the main call to arms literally is, I have my rights, right?
So this is all getting to the thesis that anti-immigration comes from this individualistic mindset.
Yeah. Well, the anti-immigration, and then the flip side is that the social-political imbalances that got established between the countries are also rooted in that. Because see, instead of thinking as America as a society that we're all a part of, the U.S. thinks of itself as an individual.
Me.
Yeah, and so, but again, with these, there's not all just bad or all just good. You know, there's plus and minuses. All right. So when we look at the timeline of how the U.S. developed.
Well, let's take a break and we get back. Let's continue. All right, we're back from the break. So take it away, Bert.
Okay. When we look at the timeline of how immigration kind of has developed in the U.S., in the early days pre the 1800s, immigration was not really regulated. People just arrived. And there was a lot of land, there's obviously not as many people. And people came from all over the place. And if there was open land, they would just kind of take it. If no one else kicked them out, they would stay there, right? And this happened pretty regularly. However, in 1790, there was the first federal rule related to citizenship, which is interesting. I didn't realize it was either that late or that early, I guess. In either case, it limited citizenship to free white persons of good character. Very interesting. So, of course, that would set up a system where it would create all sorts of racial imbalances. But that was the first step. It was like, okay, citizens can be people that are white, that are generally good people.
Right. So I don't know if citizenship in the early American Constitution was related to voting rights, but the voting rights were given to people of a similar description, and a lot of white people were excluded, like Catholics, Irish Catholics.
Yeah.
Not because they hated Catholicism necessarily, but they hated the groups of people that came from Catholic countries, like Irish people.
That's why they had that of good character part.
Right. But you also had to be a landowner.
Right.
The thing, though, here is that we look at that and we think, my God, that is horrible. It's oppressive. It's unfair. But in comparison to the rest of the world, that the early United States was the freest society.
They actually had voting.
Yeah, there was a large, there were thousands of voters.
Right.
It wasn't a small group of senators in Rome. It was thousands of people that could vote. Now, we look back and say that's horrible that you didn't include Catholics and women and black people, but it was a massive expansion of the right of citizenship and the right to vote, the right for power, Right. And ever since then, it's been expanding.
Yeah, and it's this dichotomy that's set up from that moment, though, where, as I said, the immigration was unregulated. People were just coming. But the folks that were in power start going, okay, well, we need some barrier here.
Yeah.
And at the time, it wasn't a wall.
Yeah. I have a feeling we're going to get a lot of emails from experts in these areas because we're bastardizing a lot of things in all likelihood because we're not experts in this area. But I'll also say that the societies I was comparing to in terms of the freest, often we don't know about a lot of the other societies that we don't often talk about, like there were Native American tribes and groups that did have a more Republican way of operating in terms of power, voting and this sort of thing. So I'm mainly comparing it to the colonial powers of the time and how the early United States was a shining example of expanding the rights to people.
Of the empires, it was the more progressive empire. Okay, so then after this, early 1800s and all through the 1800s, the immigration continues and it starts getting more aggressive because you mentioned something. You have some Irish background, right? You, I'm sure, are aware of what happened in the 1800s in Ireland that might have caused...
A famine.
Yes, a potato famine. By the way, I've always been confused about this. Is it that the potatoes weren't growing because of disease?
Yeah, I think there was blight. Oh. Some sort of fungus or something.
And didn't they have other foods?
Well, right. So I think there's a whole deep dive you could do just on this topic of how the colonialization of England, of Ireland, the raping and killing and the power, but also I think the extraction of food from Ireland by the powers that, the slow kind of... Yeah, there's a whole kind of story there, and if Ireland was left on its own, they might have been okay with one crop going bad, but because of the cascading effects of colonization and harm and economic disparity, it kind of left Ireland up to this extremely vulnerable state, I think.
So either way, huge arrival of Irish immigrants as a result, trying to seek food, basically, in new land. And, of course, tons of discrimination against the Irish. At the same time, on the other side of the country, but, of course, they started moving through the country, a ton of Chinese immigration as well. Now, towards the end of the 1800s, there is a new movement called the Know-Nothings. Have you ever heard of these folk? The Know-Nothings.
Yes, I have heard of this.
I think this sounds familiar to me, but I don't remember. It was a nativist movement, one of the early nativist movements, and they wanted restrictions on immigration. This was kind of one of the first big, like, hey, this is getting out of hand kind of situation. And one of the main things they were scared about, I'll tell you, it's related to Chinese immigration, but what do you think they were most concerned about?
About Chinese immigration?
Yeah.
Well, it's mainly jobs, but I don't know.
It's a little surprising. Well, at least I was surprised.
Religion, food.
I think it is related to religion. Their main concern was that the Chinese women were coming to be prostitutes. So, like, essentially their concern was like, all these Chinese immigrants, these Chinese women are all evil prostitutes.
Well, there's a market.
I know, right? Yeah. It's the typical, like, I can't even. They're basically pointing their own finger at themselves going.
Well, also, I don't know the history, but I'm pretty sure not every, I'm guessing it wasn't even a majority of the women.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But the point is that they hung their religious hat around that and be like, yeah, this has got to stop.
Well, so again, you just have to follow the money. So if you have white people that are traveling west to work and they're being displaced by Chinese immigrants who are working, then you're going to have people that are going to fight, and you're going to pull at whatever string, because you can't say, "Hey, I want the job."
They took our jobs.
Yeah, and because the business owners will be like, "Well, I don't know. I just hired the best people to do the job," and you can't argue with that because that's the American way, right? But you need to be able to pull at a different string, and the strings you can pull out are religion and nativism
and this is a theme that's going to hurt us all the way till now, which is that instead of being able to have a realistic conversation about what is happening, what we're afraid of, and how to deal with it, this is what happens, right? Is that essentially we come up with scapegoats and boogie people. So in reality, is it a problem?
I like how you want to be inclusive, boogie people.
Yeah, it could be boogie babies. You have an area of people that are working and all of a sudden start realizing that they're losing jobs to a new set of people coming. Why can't you have a conversation about that and see, what can be done? So as you were saying, like, well, that's not the American way. Well, yeah, there's all these things that get in the way. And so instead, let's invent some religious objection to, it's terrible. So this starts, then a little later, getting closer to the 1900s.
Yeah, well, and just to make a parallel to today, and maybe you're getting here eventually, is that instead of worrying about economic security, job security in areas of the United States where currently things aren't going well, you say that immigrants are eating cats.
Yeah.
Because you can't say, hey, I don't have a job.
Right.
Can you please help? Or, hey, a company decided to screw over the American people by doing X, Y, and Z. The corporations can pay off the politicians. So the politicians have to pull at something.
Exactly.
And to get votes from people that are worried about their jobs, they just pull on the string of racism and anti-immigration and fear. Yep. So that's a long tradition, I'm guessing, of societies around the world, and the American West pulled at that string.
And so then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is imposed, which is the first race-based exclusion act for immigration. And of course, I mean, you got to be right, because they came up with a list of undesirables, and it was all about, limiting who could come and work. And of course, then later, as 1900s start, they start imposing literacy tests. So, hey, if you're going to come here, you have to have a certain amount of literacy. And
which would exclude non-English speaking.
Basically, yeah. And lower class, even from, places like Ireland or others that may not be literate. And then they also came up with something called the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, which was basically saying, well, you can have this much immigration, but not more than this many number of people and things like that. And so this kind of era, this was, I guess, post-World War I, pre-World War II. There was the Immigration Act of 1924, which capped arrivals. So I think, obviously, after World War I, there was another influx, right? And I think folks were feeling like, whoa, what's going on? We need to cap this. So there was that feeling. But these caps were less to do, at least on paper, they were less to do with race and things. In practice, of course, they were barring mostly Asians, and they were favoring Northern and Western Europeans, right? So like in theory, the law itself didn't have that racial component, but in practice, they were limiting by race.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even more specifically, my people, Japanese people, farmers in Washington State, were by law prevented from owning land, which is, even though they were born citizens, my ancestors born here in Washington State,
and you
couldn't own land, so they had to lease. And then when World War II came around, they didn't have any assets to hold on to, and they just lost everything, So that was happening as well. So not only is there anti-immigration of like, you can't get in or we'll deport you, but even if you're here, you're not a full, even if you're born here.
Even if you're born here. And by the way, one of the main reasons I'm going through this history,
and my ancestors came legally. You know what I mean? They weren't. It's hard to illegally come from Japan. You know what I mean? So they came here legally.
They did everything the way they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm going through this in the first place is because, and I know that this doesn't come as a big surprise or shouldn't come to us as a big, these are not new problems. It's just that recently things are getting time is almost turning backwards in some of these cases. But we have been having immigration and negative feelings towards immigrants and stuff since the inception of the country. Okay, so then...
Well, let's take a break.
Yeah.
The rest of this will be for patrons. We want to reward the patrons with this deep dive. I'm guessing we're getting to the meat of this episode. So become a patron to hear this whole thing. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.